Brethren, we have met to worship and adore the Lord our God. Will you pray with all your power while we try to preach the word? All is vain unless the Spirit of the Holy One comes down. Brethren, pray and holy manna will be showered all around. Brethren, see poor sinners round you, slumbering on the brink of woe. Death is coming, hell is moving. Can you bear to let them go? See our fathers and our mothers and our children sinking down. Brethren, pray and holy manna will be showered all around.
Religion, which among the Americans never takes part directly in government of society, not directly, must therefore be considered as the first of their political institutions. For if it does not give them the taste for liberty, it greatly facilitates their use for it. So observe Tocqueville, page 134, talking about a variety of institutions, as he's discussed before, that moderate that tyranny of the majority that he mentioned earlier, the major problem, the single greatest danger that Americans face to themselves and their democracy. And you've got Congress and the presidency and the courts and judges. He makes a big deal about judges and lawyers. And you've got state legislatures, and you've got all these things. But at bottom, what is the one institution that is critically important in preventing tyranny of the majority? In allowing the majority to rule, yes, but making sure that the majority does it in a way that is just, right? That doesn't beat up on the minority, that doesn't force them into all kinds of groupthink like he talked about, but really understands liberty, not just as a set of rights, but as a condition of soul. Let's turn to that today and what he has to say about religion and its ability to maintain the mores that make us free, which in turn make the laws work, which in turn make the institutions work. At its bedrock, it really has to do with a deep inner disposition in people that makes them capable of freedom. So let's turn to that today. That was, by the way, Brethren, We Have Met to Worship, the most famous song of the Second Great Awakening. It's still widely sung today in Christian circles, performed by a group called the Rochesters, this Appalachian folk group that plays these old tunes again. So what about religion? A little bit of backstory. Like we said, as Tocqueville observed, one of the major reasons that people came to the New World was, of course, for religious freedom, to get away from the established churches as they existed back in Europe, particularly in England, and the Church of England. And a lot of them, the Puritans in particular, came over and didn't care too much about everyone else's religious liberty, just their own. But still, certain parts of the country had this tremendous religious diversity. Pennsylvania and Rhode Island in particular attracted all kinds of dissenting groups and denominations and whatnot. Here's the religious map of the colonies to get a sense of who went where. Most of the southern colonies, you can tell in green, were Anglican. That's the Church of England. And in later years, they would become the Episcopal Church. So today, if you see an Episcopalian church, it's a spin-off of the original Anglican Church of England. The yellow regions up around New England, that's, of course, the Congregationalists. Those are Puritans. Congregational is sort of a latter-day Puritan. And then you have Lutherans, small pockets of German settlers who brought Lutheranism over. They really settled in Bismarck, you might have noticed, but that's later. In colonial times, yeah, Lutherans brought Lutheran Protestant Christianity. Presbyterians were the more formal Protestants who derived their theology and their tradition from John Calvin, And Calvinism made its way to Scotland. And so Scottish Presbyterians settled in a lot of places. So the small pockets of pink regions here and there. And then a variety of small groups. The Baptists. It's ironic that the Baptists started off so small. Today, the Southern Baptist Convention is the single biggest Protestant denomination in the country. They're huge. But originally, they were small dissenters. They were all about adult baptism. They were all about this very informal, very individualized approach to faith. And a lot of those traditions really stuck with them even today. Roman Catholics, we'll say a lot more about, very small minority, primarily in the colony that they named after the Blessed Virgin, Maryland, Maryland, the state of Maryland today. That's where it comes from. And then small pockets of Jewish, English Jews who came over as well, mostly in Pennsylvania, like we said, and Rhode Island, fleeing the horrible persecution that they'd faced for generations over there. And of course, they would come over in much greater numbers by the end of the 1800s. And then, various reform groups: the Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, French Reformed, and the Quakers. The Quakers really had the toughest time of all religious groups, both in England and over here, because they were pacifists, because they didn't get directly involved. So, real dilemma for a lot of the states. What do you do for the Quakers? One colony in particular, though, was founded by Quakers, Pennsylvania. William Penn was a convert to Quakerism. And so, because they had suffered so much under English law as these religious dissenters, the Quakers were very tolerant of a variety of other religious denominations. And so, a lot of dissenters found a home in Pennsylvania as well. So, you can see all the little dots kind of in the eastern end of Pennsylvania there. Fascinating story, very complicated, and the waves of immigrants that came over and the way they understood what the New World was. But all in all, as Tocqueville said, and pretty much any historical record will tell you, despite their diversity, there was a surprising amount of consensus about what religion meant for public life, about how religion related to general morality. Right. So even though you had very different doctrines of salvation and the church and this and that, and theologians could hair split all over the place, at the end of the day, you always had a chaplain pray in your state ratifying convention for the Constitution, in your state assembly, any public meeting. You always had this understanding that all Christian traditions aimed at the same general morality. So a lot more unity than you would think, despite all the very different traditions there. Yeah, there'd be bantering and bickering, but there was never bloodshed like there was back in Europe. It happened, it was very rare. So, what happened in Virginia that was so important? Patrick Henry, you might remember, give me liberty or give me death, right? Later, the strong opponent of the Constitution, proposed a bill before the Virginia House of Burgesses that said, look, if we render unto Caesar what's Caesar and God's what's God's, as the gospel says, as Jesus himself says to the Pharisees, doesn't Caesar owe something to God if he's a Christian? Or in this case, the state legislature? Don't we owe formal recognition of some kind to those religious traditions that preach a very specific orthodoxy? And so he proposed a bill that wouldn't necessarily discriminate against dissenters. Yeah, you can believe what you want. You can go over there and do whatever. But as far as the state is concerned, we will make sure that we support a specific Christian orthodoxy, said Patrick Henry. To which Thomas Jefferson said no way and proposed an alternate bill, his very famous Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom. Jefferson was very proud of this document. And in fact, if you see his headstone there in Virginia where he's buried, that, as well as founder of the University of Virginia, as well as signer of the Declaration of Independence, even though he was his primary author. Not his presidency, right? He was more proud of this than he was of his presidency. But it's a heck of a document. Consider the words. Almighty God hath created the mind free, says Jefferson. That means that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens, persecution, special taxes, torments, these are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion. Jesus never wielded civil authority. He never carried a sword. He didn't conquer, at least not politically. Conquered sin and death, of course, but not, the Romans. So for that reason, truth, Jefferson said, is great, and it will prevail if left to herself. Wow, what a claim. Let truth just do her own thing, and she will prevail over error and heresy. And that was Henry's major concern, right? And a lot of Virginians thought the state has to take a firm position on orthodoxy or heresies will pop up all over the place. Jefferson said, no, no, no. It doesn't work that way. If the government takes the side of truth, even if it is absolutely true, it still corrupts it. Because what happens? You remove from her natural weapons for a free argument and debate. That is what that is how you deal with heresies and false teachings. Free argument and debate, not crack down under state law. So, what happened with this bill? Well, it went on. No man, therefore, Jefferson says, shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship or ministry, or shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but instead all men shall be free to profess and by argument maintain their opinions in matters of religion. There you have it. Religious freedom. Notice what it is, though. It's not tolerance. It's not like the state is going to take one position, it's going to favor one particular set of doctrines or a church or whatever, and everybody else will be tolerated. No, it's total disestablishment of religion. That the state is not even going to be in the religion business. It'll be aware of religion. It'll work with religion in general or with different religious groups, but it won't favor any. It won't formally establish one over others. So there you have a very firm statement on religious liberty. What happened with this bill? It was voted down like 3 or 4 times in a row, I think, before it finally passed in 1779. But by that point, you had the Constitution up and running, and the First Amendment had been added. And you can see how this Jefferson's line of thinking did a lot to frame the First Amendment. Why did we have the Bill of Rights? Because the Anti-Federalists wanted it, or some of them did, and they told James Madison, we won't agree to this Constitution unless you have a Bill of Rights. And Madison said, well, why? We've got checks and balances. Isn't that sufficient? No, it doesn't matter. We want a Bill of Rights. Okay, fine. So even though he opposed it, Madison ended up drafting the Bill of Rights. Opening line of the Bill of Rights in the First Amendment is, you've heard it before, Congress. Notice, not a school board, not a state legislature, not a city council, Congress in DC shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, right? So no Church of America. Can you imagine a Church of America? All priests appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, funded by tax dollars. No, never going to happen. No, at the same time, Congress won't choose any favorites. It won't single out a particular religious tradition as the best or anything like that. Or the other half of it is prohibiting free exercise thereof. And then it goes on free speech, free press, and assembly, and all the other rights you see in the First Amendment. But that one alone is tremendous. The fact that these two things are balanced against each other so carefully, right? On one hand, no established church. On the other hand, Congress will do nothing to prohibit free exercise thereof. Beautifully crafted words that Madison gives us, really kind of boiling down everything his friend Jefferson said in the bill for establishing religious freedom to a single sentence. Madison had a way with words, you can tell with the Federalist Papers. And so with that, as far as federal law is concerned, Jews, Quakers, not to mention Catholics, any number of other religious minority groups are protected under the federal Constitution. Now, is that going to prevent local bigotry? No, unfortunately. Is that going to prevent states from maintaining their formal churches? No, in fact, many of them did. Get to that in a second. But as far as the Constitution is concerned, all are welcome. All traditions are welcome. Free exercise is free exercise, and that's that. So it's an amazing story, the way that this developed, how easily we could have ended up with a federal constitutional amendment or something that recognized the Presbyterians, perhaps, or whoever, the Baptists or whatever. But no, it's official right up front that no religion will ever be the official religion of the country, nor will anyone be prohibited in their free exercise of religion. Think too about what free exercise means. Is that freedom of belief? Like you can believe whatever you want? No, it's exercise. Exercise is public, right? It's out there. And so, it's Catholics having solemn processions. It's Jehovah's Witnesses passing out Watchtower magazines. It's public. It's there. It's in your face. And that's what exercise means. It can't be reduced down to just belief. So what did this do for American religion? There were a lot of people alarmed to see not just Virginia disestablished, but also the federal Constitution do it. Again, agreeing with Patrick Henry, don't we owe something to God as the nation? Shouldn't the government take some position on religion? Come on. What's going to happen to religion? It's going to decline. People said, shame on Madison for drafting this. What was he thinking? Well, what did happen? Because of this disestablishment, religion went gangbusters. There were huge religious revival movements just a few years after the revolution and the founding and everything. Roughly between 1825 and 1840, historians debate the exact dates, but sometime around then, certainly when Tocqueville was here, you saw this amazing movement, the Second Great Awakening. What was it? The First Great Awakening had been in the years just before the American Revolution, and you had these famous preachers like George Whitefield and many others preaching revival, preaching this call to virtue and confession of sin and all of that. And it really made an impact on American culture just before the Revolution. The Second Great Awakening was much bigger, and it lasted much longer. It was the typical tradition, you still see this very much today in American Christianity, of the revival camp meeting. It wasn't just like a Saturday afternoon, it was like 2 weeks long. People would kind of come and go, but the major feature was the revival camp preacher, not to mention songs like Brethren We Have Met to Worship and quite a few others. But those preachers were really something. What did the message say? What was the sermon? Notice this isn't in a church, right? This is like out in the woods in upstate New York. Tents set up, people camping and staying there for days at a time. And the preacher would say, you are a sinner. Face it, admit it. No excuses. You cannot deflect blame on your rough childhood, on your, circumstances, your misunderstanding. You are the sinner. You are the agent totally responsible for the thing that condemns you and sends you to hell. Therefore, confess this to God. Give it over to him. Accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and you will be saved. And not only that, you will be sanctified. You'll be transformed as a person. And wow, did it work! Hundreds and hundreds of people going through here every day. There would be a bench right down front in front of the preacher um, where you were expected to go and sit, if you really felt called to this moment of conversion. And people would be, you'd have hands on you and you'd be just like weeping and breaking down, realizing your own condemnation by your own sin and the holiness of God, and only Jesus can save you. Just very simple Christian truths, right? But taken very much to heart in a powerful and emotional way. And it really, really worked. Mass conversions, stories of skeptics who'd show up, mostly journalists. What are these religious weirdos doing in the woods? And next thing they knew, they were down front praying the prayer of salvation. Well, who were some of the preachers? Probably the most famous one, who's most memorable, was a guy named Charles Finney. He had a great photo. He looked like an Old Testament prophet, right? He actually had a successful Manhattan law practice there in New York. And he claimed, according to his own autobiography, that one day Jesus Christ appeared to him in a vision. What are you doing for me, Charles Finney? How are you serving me? You're a great speaker, trial attorney, right? Why don't you serve me more directly? And so Finney left his law practice and just started preaching. No formal theological training at all. Most of these preachers were not trained in any way. And that was a major issue for those who were the actual ministers in the churches. But Finney became one of the most prominent speakers at these revival meetings. They weren't really celebrities. It wasn't about them or anything. They were just such effective speakers and spokesmen for the basic principles of the gospel. This moment, the Second Great Awakening, set in motion what we know today as evangelical Protestantism. Most of the Christians you'll meet out there in across America, who's the average Christian? It's the non-denominational evangelical. They trace their heritage back to this very moment in the Second Great Awakening. What did Finney say? How did he explain himself? Many years later, 1878, he was quite a bit older, but he said, what worked so well about that Second Great Awakening that he was involved in? He says nothing about his own speaking ability, right? He just says repentance implies a conviction that God is wholly right and that the sinner is wholly wrong, and a thorough and hearty abandonment of all excuses and apologies for sin. It implies an entire and universal acquittal of God from every shade and degree of blame, and a thorough taking of the entire blame of sin to yourself, right? It implies a deep and thorough abasement of self in the dust, crying out of a soul against self in a most sincere and universal intellectual and hearty exaltation of God. It's not about you, it's all about him, Finney said. This was the message that was so effective. And notice what it did. It wasn't just that simple concept of Christian salvation, but it had a byproduct. You saw benevolent societies. The Tract Society was very popular. All kinds of charitable organizations going into the tough inner cities and the really poor parts of Appalachia, and social reform movements, anti-dueling campaigns, right? Guys shooting each other in duels, temperance societies, education societies for children, Sunday school societies. All of these little organizations just went crazy across America, just really energizing the social energy that Americans had to do things themselves, to fix their social problems. And so a lot of these, yeah, were movements that came out of the Second Great Awakening. It was such a critically important moment in the development of American religion. So there's some backstory, and this is about the state that things are in when Tocqueville's in America. He never mentions the Second Great Awakening. He was there in upstate New York. He definitely saw these meetings, but he didn't seem to be aware that this was anything, a movement of any kind. He probably thought Americans did it every summer, I guess. I don't know, but this is the American Christianity that he's encountering. Well, what does he have to say about the way it relates to democracy? First of all, back up for a second. You talk about social habits and everything. He says in chapter 9 on page 128, the influence of laws is very important, and he spent much of the book talking about that already. The way laws are made at the local level, the way institutions grow out of laws, legislative, executive, judicial, separation of powers between the federal government and state governments, municipal institutions, local government. He's talked about all of this. And of course, judicial power, judges and lawyers. But at the bottom of it, what is it that really makes us free? He says in that second section on 128, toward the bottom, it's what he said at the beginning, mores. What are mores? They're like social habits, sort of habits that everybody shares and they spread. They can be very bad. This is something Plato saw, right? Something Cicero thought about, that people become tyrannical in their hearts long before a tyrant even shows up, right? Or they can be very good. They can be an inclination to virtue. It's groupthink. It's tyranny of the majority, really, but majority groupthink used in a very good way. He says, I understand the expression mores in the sense which the ancients attached to the word mores, as a reference to Cicero and Plato, right? I apply it not only to moral habits properly so called, which one might call the habits of the heart, but to the different notions men have, to the different opinions, which have currency among them, and to the whole body of ideas, from which the habits of the mind are formed. Habits of the heart are what make us truly free. Deep habits, and habits that we share broadly. Not that everybody shares them perfectly, but still, it's a broad consensus about what someone is on the inside and the way they ought to be in order to be free. Free politically, but more than that, free in their hearts, free from sin, as Charles Finney would say, right? Free in the sense the New Testament says it, slave to Christ and free from sin. Galatians 5, it's for freedom that Christ set us free, right? It's that kind of freedom that really makes us free. It's not the Bill of Rights. It's not declarations of freedom. It's not assertions of freedom. No, it's not human rights or anything like that. It's something deep inside you that makes you truly free. And in that makes you worthy of self-government. What an amazing statement he makes. I therefore understand by this word the whole moral and intellectual state of a people, Tocqueville says, 129. My aim is not to give a description of American mores. He will later, volume 2. But he says, I am limiting myself for the moment to seeking which among them is favorable to the maintenance of its political institutions. So, where do mores come from? Well, first of all, let's consider what he has to say about religion in America. What does he say? That, much like he said about the Puritans, liberty and religion are synonymous. They harmonize, they work together. Remember, back in Europe, it wasn't like that. People thought that the more liberty you had, the more religion had to step aside and decline. So, too, those who thought the more religion you had, liberty had to decline. You had to have monarchy, right? It wasn't like this in America. You see religion and liberty growing up together and reinforcing each other in some amazing ways. He points out how true this is of Protestant evangelicals, whether formal Protestants or the more revival camp meeting evangelicals, but they all agree that there is a relationship between the two. And he only mentions them very briefly because he'll come back to them in greater detail. They are, of course, the vast majority. But who's the important minority who he thinks really gets this? His own fellow Roman Catholics in America. And he has a lot more to say about them in this chapter. The Catholic population. Well, why does he say this? A lot of this is definitely in response to the absolutely vicious anti-Catholicism that was common in his day and really well into the 20th century. It wasn't really until the threat of Soviet communism became more prominent that anti-Catholicism kind of diminished about the time John F. Kennedy was elected. But if you go back to the 19th century, it was everywhere. Here's the poster, the American River Ganges. There you see St. Peter's in the distance, and there's our peaceful American shore, and climbing out of the ocean, or out of the River Ganges, I guess, or what looked like crocodiles, but look more closely. They're actually bishops, right, with the hats. And there you see these terrified Americans, the threat of Catholicism. What this was really about was, of course, anti-Irish sentiment. Irish immigrants who came over in waves, first in the 1820s, and then a much bigger wave in the 1840s, and then a much, much bigger in the 1870s and 80s. But Tocqueville mentions those Irish immigrants, and he really wants to clear up for his readers, certainly hoping Americans will read this book, just exactly who Roman Catholics are in their faith and how they understand American democracy when they come to the new world. And he says, guess what? Catholics are the most Republican and the most democratic class that exists in the United States. Not the parties, he's not talking about that, but Republican in the sense that they respect the notion of a republic, of a regime that governs itself under laws, and they're the most democratic in the sense that they are fine with majority rule, with universal suffrage, with all these things that make democracy what it is. And they really take to heart democratic principles like equality. I think it is wrong, he says in 129 toward the bottom there. I think it is wrong to regard the Catholic religion as the natural enemy of democracy. No. Among the different Christian doctrines, Catholicism appears to me, on the contrary, to be the one most favorable to the equality of conditions. Among Catholics, religious society is composed of only two elements, the priest and the people. The priest alone is raised above the faithful. All are equal below him. And I don't even know it's quite right to say the priest is raised above. He's consecrated. He has a specific vocation to be a priest. His major job is to, administer the sacraments. And in that sense, he's just as equal as they are. In matters of dogma, though, what about church teaching? What does he say? In matters of dogma, Catholicism puts all intellects on the same level. Isn't that amazing? The fact that the most brilliant Catholic theologian in the world, right, is really quite equal to the simple man of faith who doesn't, inquire into the mysteries of the Trinity or whatnot, just accepts it. He ought to grow in his faith, of course, but still, the great theologian is equal to the common man as far as Catholicism is concerned. St. Augustine is really big on this point if you read some of his writings. But yeah, it constrains the learned as well as the ignorant, Tocqueville says, the man of genius as well as the common man, to the details of the same belief, right? The creed is the same no matter who recites it. It imposes the same observances upon the rich as well as the poor, imposes the same austere practices on the powerful as well as the weak. The example we gave a few classes ago, back in the Middle Ages, right? The feudal lords sit in mass, right, with the peasants, and they hear the message from the priest. You will all be equal before God. That's exactly what Tocqueville says here, right? It compromises with no mortal, and by applying the same measure to all men, it likes to mix together all classes of society at the foot of the same altar, as they are mixed together in the eyes of God. Beautiful. So, surprise, Tocqueville says, if you really understand Catholicism from the inside, you know that it has much, much more to do with democracy, maybe even than mainline Protestantism does. That's a long shot, I guess, but that's what he's saying here. So, there's a false notion, of course, that obedience, Catholic obedience, leads to inequality. Tocqueville says, no, it's not true, because the same kind of obedience is imposed on all, right? The priest is obedient to his bishop, right? As the parishioner is obedient to the priest when it comes to his teaching, his instruction, his denial of communion in some cases, right? So what's the problem? Tocqueville says. So he mentions, who are the Catholics demographically? Well, like we said, it's predominantly Irish immigrants. Later, it would be Italians and Poles and many other groups that would come over after the Civil War. But still, he says most of them are poor. But despite that, they have great hope and love for their country, and they aspire to better and better things. They don't just languish in poverty, right? They are deeply patriotic. They come to America because they love it. They have no intention, of converting it to, Catholicism on a grand scale, though they, hope it does. But no, they come for what America is as a secular set of institutions and practices. The clergy, he says, speaking specifically of priests of the United States, have not tried to struggle against this political tendency. They seek to justify it. The Catholic priest in America has divided the intellectual world into two parts. In one, they have left revealed dogmas, and they submit to them without debate, of course. The creed, the catechism, everything. The other, though, he says, they have placed political truth, and they think that God has there left it to the free inquiries of men. God has basically said, go figure out how to govern yourselves. What's the best regime? It's the one that fits the mores of the people. Thus, the Catholics of the United States are at the same time the most submissive faithful and the most independent citizens, with all the freedom that you would expect of an independent citizenry. So, does that dispel a lot of the anti-Catholicism? Does it give suspicious, fearful, hateful anti-Catholic bigots a reason to reconsider their views? He gives a really interesting prayer in a parish that he visits at the end of Mass, where a priest gets up and delivers a prayer for Poland and the revolution going on there at the time. Almighty God, Lord of hosts, the priest says on page 131, thou who steadiest the hearts and guides the arms of our fathers when they assert the sacred rights of the national independence. Talking about Americans celebrating the revolution. Thou who made them triumph over the odious oppression of King George III in Parliament and all that, and granted to our people the benefits of peace and liberty, O Lord, turn a kind eye toward that other hemisphere, to Europe, where we see our fellow Christians struggling for the same rights we did. Notice what he says, though. God, don't just give them those rights. Don't just let them win, but more importantly, make them worthy of being free, he says right in the middle of that prayer. That's amazing. It's not just about having rights and having freedom and asserting your liberty. It's about being worthy of that liberty in your heart. Astonishing insight. He concludes the prayer, Almighty God, answer today our prayer and save the Poles. We ask this of thee and to the name of your well-loved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, who died on the cross for the salvation of all men. Amen. And the whole congregation repeats, Amen, with reverence. So, what is the relationship between religion and politics in America? Well, as Tocqueville explains, and I think this illustrates quite well, it is not direct, but indirect. Its influence comes from religion's influence comes to American politics indirectly. So, how is that? How does he explain that? Well, first of all, you have a multitude of sects, as he says on 132, multitude of denominations, a whole bunch of different religious traditions. But like we said at the beginning, they all tend to preach a common morality. They all have the same common mission of straightening things out, right? Of purifying society, even for people who don't necessarily share their religious views. And even when they do this, it's not so much to expose, it's not so much to spread their religion, but to expose the immoralities measured by a standard that everybody shares, not just their particular church or their particular organization. So it was in the 19th century, and I think it's very much that way today. Plus, this constant perception that we see that we're always falling short somehow. There's always something to do better. And there you see some real residue of the Puritans. Here's a survey from Gallup. Forget what year. I'm guessing the last 10 years or so. Asking people how are we doing morally as a country? Overall, 60, or sorry, yeah, I can't read that. Yeah, 64% are pretty bummed, right? To 35% that say we're doing okay. But then break it up by age, right? The young people, they're more optimistic. Morally, we're fine, 53%, 47%. But then go down the scale, the 30 to 49-year-olds, oh, everything's so immoral. The older you get, it's worse. And then it gets worse to 65 and over by 71%. So much immorality out there. And, maybe they're right. Or maybe they just get old and pessimistic. I don't know. But notice what this means, that in general, this reforming spirit that Americans have never goes away, and it really reveals that common morality that we have, maybe derived from religion. People often say that, but I think, as Tocqueville points out, no, the mores are kind of already there. Religion just kind of props them up and reinforces and strengthens them in certain ways. And so, yeah, we always have this sense of, that we need to do better on something. We need to do better on this and that. Plus, consider the issues and what consensus there is on certain things. When it comes to birth control, divorce, sex between unmarried men and women, right? There's sort of like an indifference there. Birth control, obviously, the dissenters are the faithful Catholics and Mormons who are against birth control. But then go down the list and look at the stuff at the bottom. And again, this is a question of what do you consider morally acceptable, right? At the very bottom, 9% approve of extramarital affairs. The remaining 94%, no way. What is it about marriage and marital fidelity that Americans just can't shake? And notice, this is all of society, right? I mean, this is Democrats, Republicans, this is everybody. We all agree on these certain moral principles. That plus human cloning, polygamy, right? Suicide, cloning animals, pornography, sex between teenagers, abortion obviously is closer to 50-50, as we know. But isn't it amazing that there's such a broad moral consensus there? And none of these are derived specifically from religious teachings. Maybe they are for some people. But instead, they're just a general sense of morality that religion kind of reinforces. Common morality is very strong even today. Despite the pessimists, there is quite a bit. There is quite a bit of disapproval of things. What else does he point out? The fact that religion, uh, yeah, the fact that religion is strictly nonpartisan. Religious leaders, ministers, priests, rabbis, they tend to not get political, at least not specifically. Sometimes they do. You hear about ones that do, and they make big headlines. Some of the MAGA church pastors you've heard about around the country, Father James Altman in Wisconsin, I've heard a lot about, and these figures that just get really directly involved in politics, but they're rare. Far more often, religious leaders are concerned about the political state of things. They'll pray fervently for public officials, they'll pray for the election and whatever, but they don't take a side and they don't tell their parishioners exactly how to vote or what to do. That's amazing. The fact that it's so nonpartisan and everyone kind of agrees to it. Um, so yeah, religion is predominant over morals, not over partisanship, he says on 132. But then again, where do the mores come from? There is tremendous dependence on marriage and the family for these things. So religion creates them in a way, but more importantly, they're generated, he says very specifically, by women. And he'll have a lot more to say about American women later. But yeah, he says that the soul of the woman is the source, and it is the woman who forms the moral habits in her children, obviously, but also in her husband. The expectation she places on him to restrain himself, to be a better man than what he is, right? That in turn makes him more fit to be a citizen. Plus, he says America is undoubtedly the country in the world, sorry, the country in the world where the marriage bond is most respected and where they have conceived the highest and most just idea of conjugal happiness. And again, he'll come back to this, but he's amazed at how seriously we take marital fidelity, about the way marriage is understood as an institution meant to perfect each of the two spouses, not make them perfect, but make them better, make them more virtuous. So religion reinforces that. Very different from the way it is in Europe. He'll do a lot of comparisons. But no, in America, the home, he says in 133, is the picture of order and peace. In the first paragraph. There, all his pleasures, the citizen's pleasures, are simple and natural. His joys are innocent and tranquil. And since he arrives at happiness by way of regularity of his life, he becomes habituated to regulate his opinions as well as his tastes. Not so in Europe. Whereas the European seeks to escape his domestic distress by going to society, it's the other way around. The American draws from his home love of order, which he then brings back into affairs of the state, right? So the European wants to get out of the house and go out into the public world. The American, it's the other way around. He wants to go home to get away from the exhaustion of society and politics in particular. So what else does this do to us? Or sorry, what else does religion do for us, I should say? It's indirect influence. We have an attitude toward progress that's kind of unlimited sometimes. I mean, really, what's the difference between a railroad train and human cloning? Aren't both of them conquests of nature? Or you could put an airplane up there, I guess, would be even better. But don't both of them overcome natural limits and boundaries and make things the way we want them? And aren't these just great expressions of human power? But clearly one is different from the other, right? I mean, you can point out some immoral things about railroads, I guess, but is it on the same level as cloning human beings? Well, as Tocqueville says, this attitude toward extreme power is not stopped. I mean, religion's not opposed to progress. That's a dumb stereotype. But religion does moderate it. It makes us think twice about just full speed ahead progress. It makes us think, does it attune more to human dignity? Does it affirm what's good for human beings? Or does it degrade us in the name of just change? Are we really progressing in the sense that we're improving? Or are we progressing because we're just bored and we want something new and we want to overcome all chance and all mishap? That seems to be the attitude toward, biotechnology and cloning, right? Religion puts the brakes on all this, Tocqueville says. In this way, therefore, page 134, at the same time that the law allows American people to do everything, right? They got a lot of power. What does it do? It prevents them from imagining everything and keeps them from daring everything. And so, back to that line I opened with, religion, which among the Americans never takes part directly in the government of society, nonetheless shapes it indirectly. For it does not give them the taste for liberty, like I said, but it facilitates their use of it. It gives meaning to liberty. Back to that Cotton Mather sermon he quoted back in the Puritan chapter. There's a kind of liberty that's like anything goes, you do whatever you want, but then there's a kind of liberty that's the freedom to do what's right. Which of those is the truer liberty? Religion teaches us that very well, Tocqueville says, in America. But all in all, it's synonymous with liberty. Not just religious liberty, notice. That's very important. But more than that, it's liberty in general. All liberty is synonymous with religion as far as Americans are concerned. That's an amazing claim. So a couple examples I think that illustrate this. If you go back to the election of 1800, there's another propaganda poster against Thomas Jefferson, ran for president in 1800, the first Democratic president, first party president ever. And the Federalists were outraged and horrified at this. And they tried to portray Jefferson as this radical religious skeptic. He kind of talked that way sometimes. It was hard to tell with him. He was tricky. But here's the cartoon of a providential detection. Here comes the eagle sent by the eye of God to stop Jefferson from committing this monstrous thing. And what's he about to do? He's about to burn, no, notice, not the Bible on the altar to despotism. Might be hard to read, but it's the Constitution. So that really illustrates quite well the indirect influence of religion on democracy. It's not so much that Christianity is in danger, it might be, but more than that, our political system is in danger. And so the more faithful we are, the more our secular institutions flourish. That's the way Tocqueville sees it. So, yeah, but attitudes toward religion around the world, though, there's a really fascinating graph. Religion does more harm than good if you ask people in different countries. Notice Western Europe, right, plus Australia, really pessimistic about religion. It's more harm than good to the tune of 60 some odd percent. Poland a little lower because Poland is intensely Catholic, 49%. But then United States, 39%. South Korea and Japan even lower. I'm not sure why Japan is there. Probably because Japan is just largely indifferent toward religion. South Korea is intensely Christian, a lot of Pentecostal Christianity over there. But yeah, I think we still sense very well the good that religion does for us. But all in all, he points out something really important. What's the common accusation? Religious people are too concerned about the next world to care about this world, right? And everything they do in this world is just kind of secondary to heaven. Not true, says Tocqueville. Yeah, heaven's the priority, but that doesn't diminish at all what we do with the world here. This goes back to St. Augustine, right? City of man, city of God. Religious people, it turns out, care for this world just as much as the next. He says in the middle of 135, if you think that these men act only with a view to the other life, to the next world, you're mistaken. Eternity is only one of their concerns. If you question these missionaries of Christian civilization, you will be very surprised to hear them speak so often about the goods of this world and to find politicians where you thought you saw only religious people. All American republics stand together, they will tell you. If the republics of the West were to fall into anarchy or be subjected to the yoke of despotism, they say, the republican institutions that are flourishing in the Atlantic coast would be in greater danger. Therefore, we must spread, notice, not just Christianity out west, but liberty too, existing alongside of each other. So, he mentions a few other things. The fact that Americans worry a lot about the decline of religion, and yet it never actually declines here. You know, it makes big headlines when you hear about the decline of religion, but it always bounces back up. It always maintains itself. And that's largely because of disestablishment. That's largely because of our dependence on those mores that religion reinforces so well. So, all that said, if you wish to prepare men to be free, he says on page 136, reconsider the value of religious revelation and what it does for society and the way that it gives us that powerful social energy to do good, to show charity, to found orphanages and tract societies and temperance societies, you know, all kinds of organizations out there, the Salvation Army. He says, when these men attack religious beliefs, they follow their passions and not their interests. If you care about liberty, see the value of religion. Take the example of the Americans. It is despotism that can do without faith, after all, not liberty. Religion is much more necessary in the republic, which they advocate, than in monarchy, which they attack, and in democratic republics more than all the others. How will society avoid perishing if, while the political bond is loosened, the moral bond is not tightened? And what can be done with a people that is master of itself if not subject to God? Do you hear a slight sense of euphoria, right? And excitement about religion in Tocqueville? It's not clear how seriously he took his Catholic faith. He was a very cultural Catholic coming from France at the time. But it is widely believed that his time in America really did reinvigorate his faith. He saw something new in it. He saw its practical consequences for liberty and for human happiness in general. And you can really detect in this text this kind of awakening in himself. Um, who knows? Maybe he started going to daily mass when he went back to France. I don't know. But something about his experience here really got to him. Why does religion do so well in America? Why does it endure? And he points to one simple thing. It's precisely that disestablishment of religion that we talked about, as stated in the First Amendment. He uses the term separation of church and state. That's kind of a loaded term today, as we know, and it's taken on a whole different meaning in our time. But in general, if you put it in the context of what he means, it's simply disestablishment, right? The fact that the church is no longer part of the state. Along with the First Amendment of the US Constitution, what did states do? Remember, they were still allowed to have formal churches. Some of them disestablished quite early on. Virginia dropped its formal Anglicanism in 1777 in the middle of the Revolution. So did North Carolina, 76, South Carolina, 78. But then a few held on quite a while after the Revolution. Georgia and Maryland went early too, but then others held on for quite a while, especially New England. Connecticut, New Hampshire just couldn't let go. They kept their established churches for quite some time. The last one to go was Massachusetts. No surprise. The Puritan heritage there was very strong, and they did not want to disestablish their congregational tradition, but finally they did in 1833. Right. So when Tocqueville was here, there was only one state left in the Union that had an official church. But they realized, why do this, right? Not for the sake of secularism, not religious skepticism, but why? Because they saw if you disestablish, religion does better, right? It does better than it would otherwise. So, what does he have to say about this? Again, he wants to emphasize that freedom and religion are synonymous in America. And as democracy spreads in other parts of the world, especially in France, where he's from, we ought to consider the important relationship that exists between them. And he's got to admit, upon my arrival in the United States, it was that religious aspect of the country which first struck me. It was the first thing he noticed, right? When he arrived there in New England. As I extended my stay, I perceived the large political consequences which flowed from these new facts. I have seen among us a spirit of religion and a spirit of liberty almost always march in opposite directions. Among us, he means back in France. But here in America, I found them intimately united with each other. They reigned together on the same soil. So, what makes all this possible? He mentions again the clergy, the fact that ministers don't get directly involved in politics. Priests, rabbis, and ministers don't run for office, right? Sometimes they were former politicians, but that's pretty rare. Usually they're called to one vocation or the other. But what's the threat of decline? What could happen if religion goes away? Well, first of all, to backtrack, why is it good? Sorry, I skipped a certain point here. Why is this vibrant religion good? Because it instills, of course, a sense of hope, hope that's beyond this world. And in doing that, it checks the powers of this world. He points out that it is human nature to be religious. And that's a point he'll make many times. If Aristotle said we're political by nature, Tocqueville says we're religious by nature too, right? The fact that we are always inclined to some sort of transcendent spirituality of some sort or another. And so when you have established state churches, like in the old days in these states or back in England or in France, or whenever there's Napoleon declared the Catholic Church the official church of France back in the day, what happens? Inevitably, you are favoring some people over others, and you're not going to persuade anyone by establishing it through law, to restate exactly what Jefferson said. Plus, he says religion brings out the nobler passions in people, whereas politics tends to bring out the nastier ones. I mean, there are some noble passions in politics, but more often it's what? Anger and fear, right? Whereas religion, yeah, it's hope. It's a desire to reform yourself. He mentions on 139 too that political trends come and go. Religious doctrines tend to stay the same. And where do you want to plant your feet, right? In something that's moving or something that stays still. Religion, he says in 139, deals with enduring concerns. It applies the same to all periods of history, he says, and it defies the force of time. Eternity is the opposite of time, or at least it can only be destroyed by another religion. But when religion wishes to base itself on the interests of the world, it becomes almost as fragile and all the earth as all the earthly powers. So, if you mix church and state, right, if you let religion become part of politics in that way, what happens? It's going to pass away with the political trend. So much better to set it apart. So much better to let it be its own thing. To create such an alliance between church and state, he says, is burdensome in the middle of 139. Burdensome to religion. It's a burden that religion shouldn't have to carry. Separate it from the state, and religion becomes free to be what it's supposed to be for the salvation of souls. It's an easy error, he says, to try to mix the two things and think you have a responsibility to do it. But it's a really easy error, he says, in democratic times. To the degree that a nation assumes a democratic social state, bottom of 139, and so societies are seen to incline toward a republic, it becomes more and more dangerous to link religion to authority. For the time is approaching when power will pass from hand to hand, when political theories will succeed one another, when men, laws, and constitutions themselves will disappear or be modified every day. And this state of things will last not for a particular time, but forever. Agitation and instability result from nature of democratic republics, just as immobility and somnolence from the laws of absolute monarchies. If Americans, 140, if Americans who change their chief of state every 4 years, president, choose their legislators every 2 years in the House, and replace their provincial administrators every year, if Americans who have abandoned their political world to the experiments of innovators had not placed their religion somewhere outside of the world, what would their religion be able to hold on to in the ebb and flow of human opinions? It's a good thing, he says, that these two are separate. The influence is indirect, but if you made it direct, it would only harm religion, he said, and all that it has to offer. So he believes it in democracy. He says something really remarkable there on 140, below the middle. You see man in his natural state toward religion. Having an official state church is artificial, but here you see him in his natural state in his pursuit of God. But sorry, I skipped ahead. What can go wrong? What happens if religion declines? Two great dangers, he says: schism and indifference. I'm not quite sure what he means by schism. That might be an odd translation, but really you can tell what he means in practice is just decline of belief, skepticism, atheism, doubt, and accepting doubt. And that's fine in personal life. Everyone struggles with faith, of course. But what happens if it becomes like a prominent public thing? There's a free thinking or a free thought cartoon. Do you go down the road toward religious despotism and backwardness and superstition, or up to the sunlit lands of enlightenment and reason and science? Right? It's a common dichotomy. Tocqueville says, look, if you take that road on the right, you're just going to end up not in enlightenment and reason, but with what? A whole other religion. That's an amazing observation, that there's always some religious impulse in people. Look, if we're religious by nature, even if we reject traditional religion as we perceive it, just deny Christianity, okay, fine. You're still going to come up with some other religion. And he really kind of says that maybe not to say that atheism is a religion, but it does culminate in a kind of pseudo religion, at least when it's believed, when it's accepted on a broad scale. So, consider totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, right? Look at those statues in North Korea, people bowing down to them, of Kim Il sung and Kim Jong il, of founders of North Korean dictatorship. Can you deny there's something kind of religious going on there? Even though North Korea is an atheistic regime. Look at that poster of Joseph Stalin with Vladimir Lenin looming in the background in the Soviet Union in the 1950s, right? Isn't there something kind of pseudo religious going on? So, yeah, the more we deny religion, the more we reject it, the more we tend to come back to a whole different kind of religion that is actually a whole lot worse. It's terrible. It's totalitarian, really. So, what does that tell us? There's schism or denial. And again, that's an odd choice of words he has, but we see what he means. But then there's just indifference. This idea that religion is just kind of meh. And we say separation of church and state today. This is usually more what people mean, not what Tocqueville's saying. But why is religious indifference more of a problem? He says those who are indifferent lose the practical value of religion in public life. They don't see what religion actually does for liberty, as he's been saying over and over again. So, yeah, you hear so much about this today. You get atheists and agnostics, but then you get what are called the nons, not nuns, but nons, N-O-N-E-S. And between 2007 and 2021, according to this graph, they're growing as Christianity is declining. You get a variety of other religions down at the bottom. But yeah, more and more people who aren't necessarily hostile toward religion, they just don't care about it. It's just kind of like doesn't mean anything to them. Yeah, believe it if you want, they say, but it just doesn't mean anything, right? Um, Tocqueville says both of these things are great dangers. And notice he says not just to religion, but to liberty too. Both the doubters and skeptics are more likely to run into the arms of totalitarianism. So, too, the indifferent nons are more likely to accidentally slip into all kinds of pseudo belief, but also lose the practical value of religion, as he says here. So, great observations. Big picture, what does it all mean for self government and democracy? Things that maintain democratic liberty in America, that prevent tyranny of the majority, as he's mentioned before. Well, good laws are good. Constitution's amazing. So are all the state constitutions, and so are all the laws out there. You have plenty to criticize, but all in all, Americans have a respect for the rule of law. They have a lawmaking ability that's quite good, but it's deeper than that, says Tocqueville. Like you said at the beginning, good mores, those habits of the heart, are exactly what make good laws possible. He goes through some test cases at the end of that chapter, page 143, and he says, could it be the geography of the United States? He says, well, if that's the case, why isn't Latin America doing as well with democracy as they've declared independence from Spain as the Americans have? So it must not be that. Is it resources? Well, once again, you would think Latin America would be doing so much better if they had the same resources and there were more resources than the United States, and yet somehow the United States is doing better. So it's not physical circumstances that do it. He says, consider the French up in Canada. The fact that French Canadians, live in a pretty narrow strip of land. They're not interested in spreading out so much. And really, they kind of recreate France in places like Quebec and Montreal. So the nature, he says in 144, in delivering to the Europeans the solitary expanses of the New World offers them goods which they do not always know how to use. The French didn't really use much of land. That's why there were never major conflicts between the Canadian government and First Nations, indigenous people, because the French weren't out for land. They were more interested in fur trading and just living in their cities. The English, on the other hand, were spreading out, spreading out. There was bound to be conflict there. Okay, maybe it's good laws. Maybe it's checks and balances and all of that. Maybe it's the brilliantly designed Constitution or just the principles of independence themselves. He says, well, if that was the case, then you would see Mexico doing much better with democracy. Their principles of independence were the same, but they're not doing as well at his time. Just consider within the United States. The further east you go, the more vibrant and healthy democracy seems to be. The further west you go, remember he went out to like Milwaukee, Green Bay area, the more the Wild West it is, the more disorderly and anarchic it seems to be. So what does that tell you? Mores, mores, mores. Those social habits, those deep ways of shaping one's heart and a whole society doing it, that bond of trust that exists between people. He says at the end of 146, it is therefore especially their mores which make Americans of the United States alone among all Americans capable of supporting the empire of democracy. And it is also they which cause the different Anglo-American democracies to be more or less well regulated or prosperous. He says, paragraphs down, I am convinced that the happiest situation and the best laws cannot maintain a constitution in spite of mores. So if you have all the resources, all the land, all the good laws in the world, if you don't got the mores, you're not going to be free and the system is not going to succeed. The Constitution assumes a lot about the character of the people who live under it. The importance of mores, he says, is a universal truth to which study and experience constantly lead back. And he says, it's where all my ideas end up, right? And he has a very funny last line in this chapter where he says, if I have not succeeded in making the reader feel in the course of this work the importance which I attribute to the political experience of Americans, their habits, their opinions, and their mores for the maintenance of their laws, I have failed in the principal aim of writing this book, right? Got it, everybody? Habits of the heart are fundamental to freedom, so much more so than laws or circumstances or even luck. What does this mean for responsible citizenship? It's pretty clear. You thought responsible citizenship was what? Running for office. That's great if you do. I'll be very proud of you. You thought it was voting and staying informed and staying on top of the news. That's all good too. That's all very important. But what is it really about? It's how you raise your kids. It's how you pass on those mores to them. It's how you get married and understand how marriage transforms you into something better than what you are. It's how you shape your own heart. It's how you let God shape it to make you free and worthy of the liberty that you have inherited. When we come back,